talking with John Bussell about the history of the Busselton Jetty.
Well, the history of the jetty is, to a large extent, the history of Busselton. Without the jetty, there probably wouldn't be much of a town here at all. In the early days, the people just rode in and out, and they realised they'd have to get something better. So they worked on the idea of getting a jetty, and they worked on it for some time, starting from about 1850. The first plan for a short jetty of about 50 metres or so wasn't really acceptable, so it was dropped. So they decided they needed one a bit longer. So they got their heads together and worked on a plan to get a jetty of about 150 metres long. So for many years they made use of that, and they just carted things out to the end of that with horses pulling railway wagons out to the end, and the wagons were loaded up with the timber and whatever else was needed to export and import. They made rails to run the wagons on, and the rails weren't made of metal, they were made of wood. So they used timber from the Jewett forest, and they ran the wagons up and down on that with the horses. So at the end of that jetty, they used to swing the loads out to a vessel which was called a lighter, sort of a flat-bottomed boat that didn't need much depth, and they'd swing the loads onto the lighter, and they had another ship waiting further out to sea. So they'd sail the lighter out, load it up to another ship further out. Quite a business to load all that timber or what have you into a bigger ship. The timber was coming from various stations around the area. It was probably brought up to the jetty by bullock teams pulling wagons, and then it was loaded into the carriages, pulled out to the end of the short jetty. This continued for many, many years. There were a series of stages by which they set about extending the length of the jetty. One of the first big steps was to increase the length of the jetty to several hundred metres further out to sea, and that was called the first head, and they could pull the lighters into the first head, and then they could do the transferring as necessary. Some ships may have even tried to load materials at the first head without lighters, because the water was getting deeper and the ships were getting bigger. And so that continued up until about the 1890s, and they were still extending the jetty longer and longer as necessary for the bigger ships calling in at the jetty. A lot of the timber to build the jetty was coming from local timber millers. One of these was Mr. Yelverton, who supervised the building quite often, and Jarrah timber was used to make the jetty longer and stronger. So this continued on stage by stage, second head, third head, till about the turn of the century, 1890s, they started to realise that the quantity of timber going out was increasing considerably. So the alternative was to think about sending timber maybe to Bunbury, but the idea finally settled was to construct another jetty, which they called the railway jetty, or the new viaduct. By 1910 or so, they had built the skeleton jetty, or the railway jetty as it was called, and it was planned to join up with the old jetty at round about the first head somewhere there, and that was called the junction, and then that would run alongside the old jetty to its full length, and the trains would carry the timber out there, and the water was deeper, so they'd be able to transfer the goods much quicker from the jetty to the ships. So from then on, it was a matter of extending both jetties until it got to its maximum length at the number 4 head, which was about 1,847 metres from the shore. When they got out to the full length of the jetty still wasn't really long enough, or the water wasn't deep enough, so they brought in dredging machines from elsewhere and deepened the water at the far end of the jetty so that the bigger ships up to about displacement of 10,000 tonnes could pull in either side of the jetty. So there'd be quite often 2 large ships tied up at each side of the jetty. And the trains would be going up and down the skeleton jetty and to the far end constantly during the day and the night to bring the large quantities of timber that was stacked in the yards at the foot of the jetty right to the end. And they had to hire a lot of workers to work the machines to transfer the timbers from the jetty to the ships, and they were lowered down into the ship's hold with what they called donkey engines that were putting the bundles of timber down into the ship's hold, and that would continue night and day until the ship was loaded with the order that was required for that ship to depart. And Busselton was known as one of the safest and fastest loading ships around the coast, or even in Australia, for efficient loading of timber. And a lot of the workers had their own employment in other occupations, such as farming, and they'd have a big call-up and they'd have a regular list of names, and people would be on the list and they'd be called up every time a ship came in. So there was always a willing list of people who wanted to be employed to load the vessels that were coming in. There used to be ships tied up out there that came from England and India and Japan and New Zealand and all the eastern states of Australia. So yes, that was said that they even used Jarrah timber to pave the streets of London at one stage. They used them as a end on down into the roadway to make roads in England with Jarrah. And West Australian mahogany, or Jarrah as it was called, became hugely popular and known around the world as a good supplier of Jarrah. And this business of loading the ships as they came in continued until about 1972, when it became obvious that the jetty wasn't long enough, the water wasn't deep enough, and the port in Bunbury was becoming fairly popular because the government built a land-backed wharf over there, which made calm water and deep water port. So eventually the jetty was closed for exporting timber about 1972. Well, after 1972, the jetty was kind of on care and maintenance largely, and not a great deal was spent on it, and it was mainly just used for leisure and pleasure, and people fishing and tourists walking around it and so forth. Some people started up a little tourist train on the railway jetty during the holidays. I think it was the Apex Club of Busselton that was the first to run a tourist train on the jetty, which was a couple of carriages behind a mini moke and pulled out from the base of that jetty a certain distance on the jetty. Sometimes the Kumbana Queen used to come down from Bunbury, and sometimes it would go out a short distance on the railway jetty loaded up with passengers. But it was gradually falling into something of a disrepair, and I think the turning point came when a large storm, cyclonic storm, which brewed up north of Darwin out in the sea up there, Timor Sea, I think, and worked its way down, and it had a name, Albi, or Cyclone Albi, and it eventually formed a big low off the coast, and strong winds and huge waves, and the jetty wasn't able to withstand the force of the storm. So when people went down to the beach after the cyclone had passed through, the promenade jetty was broken through in several places, and people said it was probably the end of the jetty as a feature in Busselton. And then there was a big clean-up out there. Well, the jetty marathon was followed on a number of efforts to raise money for the jetty, and we involved the mass media and politicians and so forth, and we combined efforts from fundraising from that was to collect funds for the jetty and have a week or a couple of weeks of intensive campaign to raise funds, which were revolved around the jetty walk and other things that were going on at the time during the Festival of Busselton. So huge crowds of people turned up at the jetty to watch the jetty walk in progress, and local business people donated $200 to have their name paraded by the jetty walker, myself, on the back of T-shirts that were made by the member of the Apex Club, I think. And so it showed that a number of business people were quite happy to do what they could to support the jetty. And it was thought that we should continue fundraising, although for a time we went, after the jetty walk for a while, we went into something of a break in fundraising. We weren't sure we could continue, and we had about $10,000 only in the account held at the council, where Mr. Scott was the jetty representative. But after a short break, it was decided to continue lobbying for funds and construct the underwater observatory, and also to construct an interpretive centre at the base of the jetty, so we could have a home for the jetty organisation, and that would be a income provided for the organisation. It started to become a bit of a political hot potato, this jetty. The seat of Vass was pretty active about it in some ways, and politicians were starting to talk about it, and private individuals were contributing larger amounts towards the jetty. So yes, the fundraising continued from both sides of politics, which enabled more and more sections of the jetty to be restored and maintained, and it was seen that the underwater observatory was going to be a big success. People were willing to pay to go a mile out to sea underwater to view the coral and the fish life, and so the jetty organisation started to call themselves an environmental group. So that was a big turning point, because we could raise funds more freely as an environmental organisation, and we could capitalise on the growing interest in the ecosystem of the bay, and the closure of the timber industry made it more urgent to find other ways of attracting finance, and the tourist industry turned out to be, amazingly enough, one of the main sources of income. And so the government came to the conclusion that the jetty could be a self-supporting environmental fundraising group to benefit the people of Western Australia. And the jetty continued on, and it's grown larger and bigger, and more membership and more finance from various sources. It now looks set to be a mainstay of the Busselton economy and the tourist scene for some time to come. Now the Public Works Department was faced with the prospect of which parts of the promenade jetty they felt should be demolished. So, as I said before, they burnt the jetty timbers to the waterline, the furthest ones out. They left a stub of jetty up near the beach shop, and the gantry was left also because they did not feel that should be dismantled at that stage. The gantry was left on its own, sitting out there some distance from the shore. So that was just left out there for some time while a debate went on in the community about what could be done with it. So eventually it was decided to remove the gantry from its platform out there, and it was brought ashore and then transported to the Busselton Museum yards, where it lay for a number of years. But when the jetty restorations was gaining momentum for a full reconstruction, a number of citizens decided to restore the gantry because it was in a poor state, having lain out there in the yards. So I think they rebuilt it and reconstructed it pretty much along original lines. And then when the new railway jetty was constructed, they put a separate portion of the jetty constructed alongside the jetty, and that's where it sits today, alongside the railway jetty on its own platform. But that platform has required some maintenance at times to keep it in good order, because it's quite an old object, having been made about 1860 in England.